Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Fields on Wheels. We're going to get started shortly with our fourth and last session of the day. It was interesting. I saw an article on the newspaper talked about the new Patterson grain elevator, and they were saying how, it was a new state-of-the-art type of elevator and much advanced. And, for many years, we've talked about almost every aspect of grain handling, but I don't think we've ever actually had a chance to talk about the changes that have been made in the grain handling systems. And last year, we had Mark Hemme speak about the great changes that occurred over the course of time as new elevators were built, but again, and not to know too much about those. So we invited speakers today, John Sargent and Brian Watson, to speak about the elevators and the technology and where it's at. These are folks who are building these new elevators, one here in Winnipeg and a couple of others across the prairie. So we'd like to ask them to speak on the state-of-the-art grain elevators. John Sargent is the president and CEO of Todd and Stewart, an agri-industrial contractor serving the food and agriculture industries across the United States and Canada. It was founded in 1933 and based in Ames, Iowa. Todd and Sargent is a third-generation family business specializing in design and construction of feed, grain, flour, pet food, oilseed, biofuels, and biochemicals, and other food and ag processing facilities. John received his BBA in finance from the University of Iowa and an MBA at the University of Chicago. And Todd and Sargent have been proudly serving clients across Canada since 1985. So they're not just here today new, they've been around for a while. John, I don't see Brian's screen yet, but I believe he's going to join you. And Brian Watson is a project manager with Todd and Stewart, or Sargent, sorry. And he's worked with the feed, grain, and flour industry since 2014 when he was hired by Todd and Sargent. Started as an estimator in project development department. Brian has worked with clients to develop facilities customized to their specific needs. Brian moved into the project management role in the spring of 2019 and has been working in multiple grain facilities in Canada and other ag industrial facilities in the US. Brian graduated from Iowa State University with a degree in construction engineering. And it might be interested for you to know, Brian, that project management has become a very interesting topic at the university in our business program and very much sought after. So you're in good company. John, I will turn this over to you, and thank you very much.
Yes, very good. Thanks, Barry. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks, everybody. I know we're at the end of a lengthy day of great programming, so I'll try and keep things snappy here, moving for you. And Barry, I guess I'm going to share my screen here, and apologies, having brief, I'll say technical issues. So the screen I'm going to share is it's just the it's not the running PowerPoint, but I'll keep things moving on here. I was having trouble getting the correct screen to show up. So appreciate you guys spending your time this afternoon with us. Todd and Sargent, Barry gave a great background. We design and build grain storage and processing facilities. This is not a presentation about us, but I wanted to give just a very brief background on us because I think our history mimics in many ways the history of the grain industry, including in Canada. Grain elevators, feed mills, flour mills, oil seed, anything that's taking grain in from across the prairie and either storing it or transferring it and really processing it into something else. All of those things take a facility, a building, and they take someone to design that building and to construct that building. And so that's the small role that we play in the overall Canadian ag industry. As Barry mentioned, we've been working in Canada since 1985 and are proud of our role there. I want to talk just a brief bit of our history, because again, I think it mimics what has taken place up in Canada in terms of grain storage. So we started in the 1930s, and many of you have probably seen wood crib grain elevators around the prairie. And as we started in 1933, started building out of wood. And as you might imagine, over the decades, there have been a number of technological transformations, including the use of steel. For us, started in the 1950s, maybe more prevalent in the States a bit. But then in 1969, we put up our first slip form construction, and slip form is a concrete process. That facility, our first that we built out of slip form, is still in use today in Colorado. And so I guess just to give you an idea of the longevity of concrete, but there are all different types of facilities across across all of Canada, different technologies, but have certainly transformed over the years. And we'll talk a little bit about what a state-of-the-art grain terminal looks like today. And Brian, not sure if Brian was able to join yet or not, but Brian, jump in if you're here. So I wanted to talk briefly about grain elevator construction. So as you're driving across the country, you've likely seen any number of grain storage facilities. Some of those might have been steel, some of those might have been wood, but what we focus on primarily are those facilities that were built out of concrete, or that are built out of concrete. And I guess I wanted to confirm, Barry, you're able to see the slideshow okay? Great, very good. So what you see on the right, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, that is the form system for a concrete grain elevator. And when you see a facility that's out there on the prairie, out in the field, it may look just, okay, there's concrete out in the that's out and standing 150 feet tall, but there's so much that goes into those facilities. And so when you talk about some of the companies that are building these facilities, the clients, whether it's Pearson, Heimbecker, Richardson, G3, Grains Connect, et cetera, so many of them, there is so much that goes into those types of facilities. There's from the very beginning conceptual stage, civil design, there's rail that needs to be figured out. We'll talk a little bit about rail shortly. Loop tracks versus sidings. There's an entire design that goes into the facility to figure out all of the intricacies, how many bins, different separations, what is the grain that's going to be handled, how much is the throughput, all of the electrical and controls that go in. There's typically a multi-million-dollar package that goes into these facilities to control all of the automation and power throughout the facility. Piling or deep foundation work to support the massive amount of grain that will be held in these facilities. And then of course the concrete that will need to be poured, foundations, flat work, carpentry, as you can see in these forms themselves. And then the slip form process that we'll talk a little bit more about and show you a brief video of, just because it is a pretty unique process that many people find interesting. A tremendous amount of steel that is erected on these facilities, and then millwright, which would be the installation of the grain storage and handling equipment within these facilities. So it may look like kind of a simple facility that's sitting out there in the prairie, but gosh, there is a lot that goes into these facilities, and so we're excited to talk to you just a little bit about some of that today. So slip form construction, slip form is unique. It's not something that Todd and Sargent patented by any means. We did not invent it. It's not proprietary to us, but there are not that many companies around, especially in Canada, that utilize the slip form construction process. It takes a lot of experience, I'll say, and expertise to pull off successfully. So you don't see too many contractors that build with the slip form method. It is a continuous pour. So where you see here in this photo, what you see is, gosh, I'll say halfway through a slip facility, you build the forms on the ground on a slab, and then there are hydraulic jacks that are integrated into the facility and holding up the formwork. And those jacks, every 4 to 6 minutes, those will jack up a single inch. And so over the course of an hour, you would tend to see the facility rise out of the ground by about a foot, so 24 feet in a day. 2 12-hour shifts from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. of crews that are running so you'd have a crane that would be lifting the concrete, or you might pump the concrete in, crews that are running the steel, getting all of the steel reinforcement in that helps that facility stand up strong. Just a tremendous process, and we'll talk a little bit more about that during the video. But it allows for a continuous pour, non-interrupted concrete structures that really, they tend to stand the test of time, as I mentioned with that facility from 1969 that's still going strong today. So let me play this video, and apologize it's not full screen, but so the forms are built on the ground. And you can see toward the bottom, if you pay attention closely, concrete trucks that are running in and out, and you'll see the moon moving and you'll see the sun moving. And if it were raining or snowing, you'd see that as well. So rain or shine, cold or warm, this facility continues to be built. You basically extrude the finished facility up out of those forms over the course of a typical slip might be 7 days or so. But there would be anywhere from, oh gosh, 40 to 80 people up on that deck that you saw who are making the magic happen, so to speak. So there's a lot going on deck there. So wanted to talk briefly about the evolution of rail and some of these grain terminals. I'm sure there are many people on this call who know more about this than me. So you're welcome to either share additional information, call me out for any inaccuracies, or correct me during the questions later. But just some context for those who may not be as familiar. Up until about August of 2012, the Canadian Wheat Board had I guess the technical term is monopsony. They were the sole and mandatory buyer for any wheat and barley in Western Canada. But there was a deregulation that took place in 2012. And the reason I bring that up is that due to that deregulation, there was a tremendous inflow of capital over the next several years, up to and including now, and likely will continue for some time. Private investment dollars to build up an increased network of these types of grain storage and handling facilities that are really in place to take the grain from the surrounding area around the facility and then typically put them on a train and send them out to somewhere where they can be used by end users or processed into something else. So that might be sent to an urban center to be processed into flour, sent out to serve as animal feed. A lot of the grain in Canada is sent west by rail to port facilities on the West Coast and sent overseas. So when we talk about grain and ag in Canada feeding the world, it truly is an international industry. So just fascinating to track where some of the kernels of wheat, barley, et cetera, from where they started to where they're going. So let's move on to talking about a couple different types of loop track facilities or rail facilities. So in the past, you would often see what we call siding facilities. And those would, I guess we've got a couple pictures that are coming up to talk, to show you a little bit about what those look like. Siding facility would be a much more manual process. The locomotive would need to unhook from the cars, split into sections, lower capacity for throughput, and take longer time to fill. So in a world where rail, and perhaps we have some rail companies on here who could speak better to this, but in a world where there is increasing demand for rail throughout the country of Canada, anything that a company can do to make it easier to get rail cars and quicker to use those cars would be beneficial, so that they can get a locomotive and a train in and out as quickly as possible. No chance of demurrage or penalties on extending the use of those cars. So loop tracks have been a huge change in the Canadian grain industry, and what you would see as many state-of-the-art facilities where the train would pull in, and I guess I'll show you a picture of a siding here. Where you can see there would be a main line and then a short area for cars to pull off the side of the main line. But then these loop track facilities, a couple examples from Grains Connect and Parrish and Heimbecker, where the full unit train of 110, 130, 150 cars can pull off and not even need to detach. They would simply run through the facility, and they would be really able to fill up very quickly and get that train and locomotive onto where it's going. There is a lot more investment that goes into these loop track facilities. I wanted to talk just briefly about some of the regulatory changes. So as you might imagine, over the years, there have been significant changes in regulation, both from a standpoint of fire, energy, building code, et cetera. And so you'll continue to see changes. One from the last several years was moving bucket elevators from the interior of the facility to the exterior of a facility. That would tend to be from a safety perspective. You'll continue to see changes over the years and over the decades that are designed to make these facilities faster, safer, and more efficient on the whole. Here's an example of a facility built for Parrish and Heimbecker, finished up just very recently, just to give you an idea of some of the statistics on a facility like this. And I won't read all these numbers, you can see these, but really, and I guess you can see the crane putting some of the finishing touches on this facility here, but hundreds of thousands of tons of grain would move through a facility like this throughout the course of the year. And you can see some of the components of the grain cleaning system here. So not just a facility that's simply moving grain, but it's also cleaning it, creating a clean stream of grain that's ready to move across, really to move across North America and then around the world. Here are a handful of the projects just for reference, and from across Canada from the last handful of years that Todd and Sargent has built. Sometimes people they look out and they think that these concrete structures aren't particularly pretty, but gosh, when we look at these, we think there's some really beautiful structures that are making an impact for a lot of people in Canada, and helping provide producers and growers opportunities to sell their grain and turn that grain into something that can really drive both the domestic and the global economy. So that's a brief outline of I'll say kind of the boots on the ground, or Barry, I guess it's shovels in the ground aspect of what are these facilities? What does it take to get them built? Hopefully you enjoyed, and maybe it spurred some questions when you saw the slip form video to show you at least a little bit about how these facilities get built. There is a tremendous amount that goes into them. We're proud to serve the Canadian grain and ag industry. I guess maybe you see my notes down there, but there are continuous improvements in performance and technology that we've seen over the last many years, and construction techniques from wood to steel to concrete, and we'll continue to see those into the future. And then honestly, the last piece, and this is probably the most fun to say, is that it's an industry that feeds the world, the Canadian ag and grain industry, and something that really the entire country can be very proud of. So Barry, that's all we had for now. So I think you were planning questions at the end, which is just great. But if there's anything that you or others care to ask now, we're certainly happy to opine, but just appreciate the chance to share a little bit about what we do.
And I have lots of questions because I find this tremendously interesting. The one question is just obviously a silly one, but does that slip form ever get stuck? Do you ever have a problem?
So if you're not careful, the slip form can get stuck, and there are other things that can come about if the weather is too cold outside. If there's lightning or tornadoes, if there's very inclement weather. The goal would always be to never have to stop that construction process as it moves up over the span of those several days. But every once in a while that does happen. There are things that you can do to help make that not be a catastrophe. But the goal of every slip is to get it up and get it done, and then I guess move on to the next one, right? I
would imagine there could be some gray hairs caused at those things.
I think we've got a talented team of superintendents and field crews. So I think a lot of times it's easy to forget that these facilities that they're not being built by me or Brian sitting here in our office. They are built by tremendously talented people out in the field who are working in the rain and the shine and the snow and the cold and the wind and doing some really impressive things. So we're always very thankful to our field people out boots on the ground.
It looks like a tremendous logistical orchestration to bring it all together at once. And we'll come back with more questions at the end. But let's move on now and ask our next speaker, Riel Tetrault. Riel is here.
Yes, hi.
Very good. Riel graduated in agriculture at the U of M in 1976. He farmed for the next 15 years after paying the 20% interest rates of the late 1980s. And some of us remember that. The bank told him to look for another profession. He then started Emerson Milling Inc., an oat milling plant at Emerson, Manitoba. It became a very successful business. And after 33 years, he sold his plant in 2020 and quickly started up a new endeavor at L'Atelier called Mid-Canada Transload Services, Inc. The new site has over 2.5 miles of rail trackage and has daily service from the BNSF and the CN railways. The idea of the new business was to transload from truck to rail and from rail to truck. The new site handles mostly grain products, but will also handle some manufactured goods. And Riel is looking forward to developing the 250 acres of industrial park and welcomes all new business. And I had a very interesting chat with Riel about the opportunity for producers to go directly to the buyer. And with that, Riel, I ask you to give your presentation on, I think we're going to talk about identity preserved grain, but whatever is within the scope.
Yes, hi there. I'm just trying to get my screen so that I can get into my presentation. All right, so my name is Riel Tetrault. I'm the owner and developer of the Mid-Canada Transload Services. We're one of the largest privately owned inland ports in Manitoba. We have a 250-acre site. We're located 1 mile south of L'Atelier, Manitoba, and 7 miles north of the Canada-US border on Highway 75. We've got daily service from both Canadian National and Burlington Northern. Santa Fe, we are 1 hour south of Winnipeg, Manitoba, right on the US-Canadian border. So we're a delivery point where individual producers or grain companies can store grain. The grain can be stored in individual bins without the grain becoming commingled in a larger bin. The multi-bin design allows for product segregation and allows different shippers to ship different commodities. Mid-Canada can then reload the grain onto trucks or rail. So sooner or later, I'll come to the identity preserved, but just there's a little bit of background on ourselves. Why did Mid-Canada start? Mid-Canada Transload Services. I used to own an oat mill called Emerson Milling Inc. And as Barry mentioned, I sold it in May of 2020. And Emerson Milling needed a place to load rail cars. They used to ship across the US and Mexico and Canada. We also noticed that there was a need for other small and medium shippers to have a place to load in southern Manitoba. So we decided let's do something to help the industry, not just ourselves. So a little bit of the history, we started in 2016, construction began. We did a lot of piles on the property. We poured a lot of concrete. And finally, in 2019, Mid-Canada Transload Services was operating and is now handling today bulk and IP commodities. We boast 2.5 miles of privately owned rail track. Each track holds 70 cars, with a third track just recently opened that holds an additional 50 cars for a total of 190 cars. Mid-Canada Transload Services can load rail directly from truck, store the product in a bin, or load the product into rail cars. Mid-Canada Transload can unload rail cars directly into trucks or into on-site storage. We've just added 250,000 bushels of storage space because of this drought that we've had in Western Canada here. We've been asked to bring grains in from the United States. And so we quickly put together some grain storage. We're not quite operational, but within the next couple of weeks, we ought to be operational on that site. So some of the features and benefits, we have direct access to 2 Class 1 railways. CN and BNSF give us the ability to reach all North America in a cost-effective way. We have daily rail service to and from Canada, United States, and Mexico. We're built on 250 acres of land, serviced with 3-phase hydro. We have natural gas and municipal water. So we're fully serviced. Now the opportunities, there are many opportunities for producers and grain companies. Mid-Canada does not buy or sell grain. We just handle it for you. Customers can rent bin space as needed prior to shipping. Individual bins do not commingle your product. And smaller bins allow ability to store identity preserved grain. So here is what I'm going to get into next, a little bit of not the commercial, but the identity preserved and how we can possibly help you. Identity preserved is designation given to such bulk commodities marketed in a manner that isolates and preserves the identity of a shipment, presumably because of unique characteristics that have value, which are otherwise lost through commingling during normal seeding, harvest, storage, handling, and shipping procedures. So everybody is now starting to look into the future, and we're looking at the consumer wants to know where his product comes from, who handles it, how is it treated. They want to know what chemicals were put on it. So there's a lot of regulations that are going into the new identity preserved. The Canadian Grain Commission Canadian Identity Preserved Recognition System, CIPRS. It's a voluntary program that certifies a company's IP system for the production, the handling, and transportation of specialty grain, oil seeds, and pulse, and it's an effective program. So the USDA definition, IP is a process of differentiating commodities requiring that strict separation, which typically involves containerized shipping, be maintained at all times. The service is provided by U.S. Agricultural Marketing Service, AMS. The USDA Process Verified Program is a verification service that offers applicants a unique way to market their products to customers using clearly defined, implemented, and transparent process points. So transparency is what the customer is looking for from the processor, from the farmer right to the processor. This is very important. Applicants with an improved USDA Process Verified Program may develop promotional material associated with their process verified points. Use the USDA PVP shield in accordance with program requirements and market themselves as USDA Process Verified. But this program does not relieve the company of meeting regulatory requirements. So some companies are even marketing themselves as giving their own IP references, and they are seeing the opportunity of marketing themselves as an IP product. These IP programs provide participating companies with independent third-party verification audit of the identification, the segregation, and traceability of their product, unique value-added characteristic. So verification is provided at every stage, including the seed production, processing, distribution, providing the buyer with assurance that the identity of the product is preserved from the requested stage of production. Now, from the Canadian Seed Growers Association, this shows the whole stage of IP. Certified seed. The grower buys certified seed, grows the crop under regulations. It is shipped to a process, to an elevator or a facility such as ours, where the IP is maintained. It is then sent to the processor. Again, the IP is maintained, and here the consumer is reading on the back of the package. The product is unique in its traceability from every stage of from start to finish. So that adds value to the farmer, to the processor, and the end user, the consumer, is satisfied, he doesn't mind paying a little bit more for the protection that he's getting, for the knowing that the product has gone through a traceability chain, and there's a transparency throughout. So IP products increase the need to segregate crops for specific end uses. Consumer demands non-GMO product. Customer demands. So that's another indication of an IP product. A customer wants a specific corn hybrid for tortilla chips. A customer wants a particular oat for a cosmetic that they're developing. A customer wants to manufacture ready-to-eat cereal or a cracker made from a particular wheat or oat variety that will help him produce a certain type of cracker, which is more crispy. It's got more ingredients that the end user, the consumer, wants to have. So very important. We feel that this is the trend of the future. Consumers want to be assured of how and where their product is made. They want to know where it's manufactured. Food manufacturers or processors have to provide this information. It's similar to the paper trail or traceability of organic, transparency for the consumer. And a lot of the products are very variety specific. So we're sort of the enabler. I like to look at ourselves as a facilitator to move your IP products or other products from your farm, or from the processor or end user wants to contract. We can help facilitate that. So we can reach throughout North America, including Mexico. We also handle other commodities. We have built, we also store lumber and steel. We have a 10,000 square foot warehouse, can store the bag products. We have a truck wash for making sure the product is kept clean. We're at a good location for a product coming into Canada or exporting from Canada. So we have future expansion. It's always ongoing on our site. With the 250 acres, we got a lot of room for expansion. We offer electricity, potable water, natural gas. Opportunities are limitless for somebody who's looking at either developing on our site, or we would want to work with them. So at this point, that's we'll take some questions afterwards, Barry. And so I thank you for the opportunity to present today, and we'll be glad to have some questions later on.
Thank you, Riel. I'm sure you'll get some. You know, I hadn't realized when we had set this up that we were going to have sort of two extremes of the market. On the one side, a very, very large elevator with a loop track and bulk handling, and at the other end, almost a boutique situation. And similarly, an inland port that's a massive 20,000 acres and one that's 250 acres. So it really is a spectrum of things and developments, and it's interesting to see there's room for everybody in this sort of activity. I will hold off the questions for now.
Sure.
And let me move to Joel Carlson, who's going to give us some crystal ball analysis, but also I think, Joel, you have a survey for us, so we get a little crowd participation as well. So I'll let you look after that, but let me just quickly introduce Joel Carlson is Associate Vice President of Canada for CPCS. CPCS is a management consulting firm specializing in transportation economics, policy, and strategy. Joel has 10 years experience in transportation systems analysis from assignments in the transportation consulting and railway industries, a graduate research at MIT. He serves also, I'd like to be proud to tell you, as the Vice President of the Canadian Transportation Research Forum. So we have a number of members here today, and of course, CTRF has also been very helpful in getting the word out of our conference, and we always appreciate that. Prior to joining CPCS, Joel worked with the Canadian International Railways. He holds a dual Masters of Science in Transportation and Engineering Systems degrees from MIT, and a Bachelor in Science and a Civil Engineering degree from the University of Alberta, where he was a top graduate in 2011. So congratulations for that. And over to you, Joel.
Thank you, Barry, for that really nice intro. Can you hear me and see my full screen slides?
We can.
Great. Well, thank you, Barry, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and learn from a wide range of experts in both agriculture and transportation and logistics. As Barry mentioned, I work for a consulting firm called CPCS, and we specialize in strategy, economics, and policy related to the transportation sector. So really in that role, we bring together that sector-based market intelligence and try to communicate it in a way that's useful for decision-making for both our public and private sector clients. In terms of the presentation today, I think a lot of what you'll see is not new to many of you, and is in fact, I hope it complements many of the presentations and rolls it up into a useful summary of today. And as Barry mentioned, I hope in part because it's the last presentation of the day, as well as to leverage the combined experience of everybody on the call today to get your feedback on what you think the future of grain transportation volumes look like from Canada. So without further ado, I'll sort of get into my presentation. So this presentation is based on work prepared by CPCS for the Crop Logistics Working Group and facilitated by the Canola Growers Association and Pulses Canada. So thanks to them for thinking of us and retaining us to do this work. And the objective of this work, which was completed earlier this year, so it relied a lot on pre-COVID, in fact, data, was to summarize historic trade volumes and transportation movements from Canadian grain and oilseeds between 2015 and 2020, as well as in this, this was an update study, and in this update study, we looked at a few scenarios to inform discussion with industry stakeholders on supply chain resiliency, which we are currently working on. And just as a note, this is obviously intended just to spur discussion and is not for any specific investment or decision making of that nature. So with that in mind, I'll start with to set the stage for the forecast that we prepared. I'll start with a summary of production, domestic modal, and a selection of supply chain trends. So not extensive, but talk about a few of those. And then present some top line scenario forecasts from our work. So this first slide should come as no surprise for many on the line, but from 2000 to 2020, annual production of grain and oilseeds has increased fairly dramatically in Canada by 44 million metric tons. So we've used MT. And this has been primarily driven by yield growth. So we see the production in the red line going from just over 60 to 70 million tons up to about 100 million tons across Canada, and yield going from about 2.5 to over 3 tons per hectare over that period. By comparison, the level of harvested area has been relatively flat, although is increased by about 10% over this timeline. So of course, this has driven increased movements to port by rail, and on the left we see hopper car movements, and on the right non-hopper car movements, which are quite a bit smaller. But this is in the past 5 years, apologies, I'm just got to close the window. Movements in Canadian ports have increased by about 9 million tons over this period. Primarily hopper in absolute volumes, hopper cars, but also non-hopper car movements have been increasing over this time. So looking further into vessels, total exports have increased, and this has included both bulk up to pre-COVID bulk and containerized shipments. So pre-COVID in 2019, containerization was about 10% of total exports from from Canada. But as we've heard on some of the speakers today, including Raymond and others, the recent increase in ocean shipping rates and container availability has created challenges, supply challenges in exporting via containers. We built up our forecast on an individual product basis. So this slide is just showing some of the main commodities that are exported from Canada. So canola and wheat over the 20-year period continue to be the primary agricultural commodities that are exported by Canada. The key export destinations for wheat include Asia Pacific gateway countries, including China, Japan, as well as the US, India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. Canola is primarily exported to Japan and China, which together they account for nearly half of Canada's canola exports. And then peas are exported to Asia, and lentils primarily to India, Turkey, and Bangladesh. As we heard earlier and will be noted later in the presentation, there has been some recent changes in those destination countries due to trade barriers over the past couple of years. And one other factor that we accounted for in our forecasts that's important to note is for some products, the processing that occurs in Canada will influence how that product is being exported. So one key example of that is canola. So the proportion of canola being crushed has increased from about 34% in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and that's gone up to about 52%. And we see continued plans to increase the canola crushing capacity in Western Canada to facilitate that continued growth. So with that context, I'll go into some of our scenario forecasts. So when I was discussing this with Barry, he wanted to assure me that it's challenging to present forecasts and maybe to take some step back and present some kind of methodological thinking and context for these forecasts. So in any forecast of the future that we're preparing, there's a number of uncertainties due to limitations in base year data, the future data that we have to predict make predictions, as well as the underlying model quality that we utilize. And those are often reflected, and you'll see that in our forecast in terms of the low-high range. That's usually pretty well documented. One of the things in terms of projecting volume forecast for long-term transportation infrastructure is the scenario uncertainty, the sudden change that are hard to predict and uncertain, and sometimes you'll see terms like black swan being referred to, these sudden changes that some will argue actually will have a sudden and if not greater long-term impact on our world or the specific topic or issue that we're forecasting. And certainly COVID is one example of that. I don't think, for example, many of us would think a couple of years ago that it would be fairly consistent to be wearing masks and other things on a day-to-day basis and see that. So with that sort of kind of methodological detail out of the way, I wanted to, our forecasts, we developed 3 low, medium, and high forecasts of 2020 to 2030 exports from Canada. And we did this through a 6-step process. Really what it was the first 2 steps was forecasting production levels and then the total export potential. And the production was based on factors including yield and harvested area. Export potential was looking at population growth overseas. And then what we did was we said, what is going to be the limiting factor? And in most cases, we applied production as being the limiting factor, but wanted to ensure we looked at the demand side as well. Then in our forecast, we overlaid some shorter term market intelligence from Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada, which produces short-term forecasts. And we adjusted our forecast, our baseline forecast, to account for that more shorter term outlook. And then we applied a low high range around that medium forecast based on historical volatility in the underlying yield growth. And then we applied a few market specific events on the forecast. So I think the biggest factor in terms of production is being driven. Yield growth is the primary factor limiting exports for commodities, including wheat, durum, soybeans, canola meal, canola oil, and lentils. We expect that yield in our forecasts are expected to continue growing, but may diminish over time. So on the right, you see what the historic yield growth has been for wheat, and it's gone from about 3 tons per hectare and has increased to 3.5, but is diminishing its annual growth. We capped harvested area for most commodities in the 2024-2025 horizon. This is in part because of the relatively slow growth and that most area available for agriculture has been utilized, but also has some practical implications in terms of not wanting to double count commodity growth because of our individual commodity-based approach. And we also considered domestic processing and consumption in our forecast. On the demand side, we considered in particular population growth. So you see on the left some of the key sources of on a percentage basis. So with Africa being the highest on a annual growth rate percentage, the fastest growing market for Canadian grains and oilseeds, but Asia, Latin America, and Oceania being other fast growing markets. And we also, for context, but an important factor is we looked at some of the cereal import dependency ratio, which is the percentage of consumption that is used by imports. And so we looked at what rates or what the percentage was in some of the key markets. And we see that how it ranges quite a bit and is an important factor enabling Canadian imports from Canada. So just before going into our forecast, this is where I wanted to get some audience participation, about what everybody thinks. So I'll maybe ask Chris if he has the Zoom poll to bring that up. I don't know if I can see that directly as a presenter. Chris. Oh, there it is. So, so as mentioned, I want to get your feedback on in 2029 to 2030, what do you predict total grain exports to be, grain and oilseeds exports to be from Canada? And this is based on the Canadian grain exports from licensed facility from the Canadian Grain Commission. And up until the year prior to this most recent crop year where there's weather has decreased output, exports from Canada have averaged about 48 million tons per year. So maybe just take a few, about 30 seconds here just to see what everybody thinks on this. One of the ways to forecast anything is to go back and look at data and try and create a model and make projections of the future. But another way is to take both general knowledge as well as expert knowledge and trying to project the future. So I'm curious what everybody thinks, and if we can get a non-scientific view of what the future would look like. Chris, I'm not sure if you're able to pop up the results to everyone, or how those will show up for everyone.
Well, we can see them, Joel. It looks like 41% have participated, so we should wait a couple of minutes more, or another minute at least, for people to
So I
make
might
their decisions.
see if I can. Oh, great! I can see them now. All right. So I think we're starting to. I think we've had about 50 responses, and the response rate seems to be trickling, slowing down. So I'll maybe just take a screenshot here, and in case I can't. In case this ends, I'll share results, and I'll bring up my screen again. All right, so we see a bit of a distribution here, ranging from about 30, the audience thinks about 30 millions of tons at the low range, and that was one response, all the way up to about 70 million tons was at the high range. The modal, so the most frequent answer we had was between 50 and 55 million tons, but I would say that looking at the average, I would probably put it perhaps a little bit higher than that, maybe at the high 55 to 60 range when we did an average after it's all done. So let's see what that looks like compared to what we thought here. So we in our forecast in our low-high range projected that export would grow from a base of about 47 million tons in the 2019 to 2020 crop year to between 48 and 64 million tons. So with the base forecast being in that high 55 range. So it looks like our projections are lining up pretty well with, I think, the consensus of the group, which is good to see and happy to see that. But that there is I'd also point out that I think our forecast, which accounted for some variability and uncertainty, but also the audience, there's still a fairly wide range of what possible outcomes of the future are that people are thinking in terms of export growth. Breaking down that base forecast, it shows a very similar distribution to historic, with wheat still making up predominantly the majority of or a significant portion of the total exports, with canola, durum, and pulses being other important categories in this breakdown. In our work, we also had a look at some third-party forecasts and tried to compare against those and validate our work. So this specific forecast that we're showing is for wheat and durum, but we looked at some of the other commodities where comparables were available. And I would say, generally speaking, in terms of this approach, we were usually in the middle. So in this case, we fell between the OECD forecast of grain exports, as well as another third-party forecast, IHS Market, and we would typically, based on our approach, landed roughly in the middle of these forecasts in the 2030 horizon. There's opportunities and risks to these forecasts, and we heard some of them already on this today. But exporters from Canada are looking to expand existing markets and diversify and make those markets more robust in terms of the volumes that they are exporting to. Exporters are also working with buyers to develop new supply chains and promote new uses of grains and oilseeds. So like I said, we've heard many of these biofuel, food ingredient production for peas and lentils, pet food production for lentils. So looking at ways to diversify their markets. And there's been recent trade agreements that should improve trading economics for certain commodities from Canada. There's also risks, mark risks to exports. So we've heard of geopolitical tensions, in particular between Canada and China, that has impacted canola. India in the past 5 years imposed some import tariffs and quotas, which impacted where lentils are exported to from Canada. There's also been non-tariff barriers that have impacted Canadian grain exports. We did some research on some of the agricultural reforms that are going on globally, and that should increase domestic production in those countries. But despite reform, it's not. We don't see it as it's not been a huge risk factor, or we don't perceive it to be a huge factor in certain markets. It's based on some of the initial outcomes we've seen. And there's been increased competition from certain producers like Russia and Ukraine for wheat exports. Though historically, my recollection is that those markets, because of different quality and perception of qualities, our export markets don't necessarily directly overlap in some cases with those. So I think it's safe to say, based on our work, and I think the sentiment is that directionally grain oilseeds are expected to grow over the next 10 years, but magnitude is uncertain. And this will, in turn, increase demand for grain handling and transportation capacity in Canada. It's worth noting that this presented our top line figures, but as you saw in some of the earlier presentations on canola, for example, there's variability in individual commodities, different scenarios in terms of what the uses of products like biofuels and so forth. So there's a lot more nuance at the individual commodity level than what's presented at the top line numbers. It's important to note. We had done a high level look at some of the containerization capacity in Canada, and in our work, but with COVID, it all and continued high ocean rates, it almost was out of date as soon as we produced it. We expect containerization to continue to grow based on some of the initiatives by ports and terminal operators to grow that container handling capacity. But at least in the short term, container rates, based on the latest intelligence from Drury, it looks like they'll continue to be disrupted at least through 2022, and still take longer to normalize after that. One factor that I'd be curious, I think, how will factors like climate change impact these trends? We projected that harvested area would stay cap out at 2025. What will be the impacts longer term? I'd be curious for any feedback from the audience, and will there be, we've already seen some variability. What are the audience views on variability? Certainly there's some potential for new areas to open up, but also impacts to existing areas, new commodities that or new types of agricultural products that may be more resistant to higher temperatures. So curious to understand what the general sentiment is on the overall impact of climate change from the audience. So with that, thank you for staying on all day for my presentation. I know it's a lot to throw a lot of numbers at you at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Winnipeg, and hope this helps everyone on the line help prepare their facilities and their infrastructure and their planning to be more resilient in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. That was excellent and interesting and very brave. I mean, anybody who makes forecasts, I always say, never make a forecast that matures before your date of retirement. That's the only safe one you can do. So I don't think you're safe. I think we're going to be here to find out whether or not your forecast does come true. One of the questions that came from the chat was dealing with the question of Africa. It's a big population and it's growing. Will the economic development there, of course, be sufficient to allow them to pay for it? One of the questions that's outstanding. I know you may not have an answer for that. It's maybe more rhetorical than anything else.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have so CPCS, we work in Africa, and but I'm not an expert in this area. I think what I've seen there's a lot of infrastructure needs in Africa. I think there is, one of the articles I saw coming from the recent COP climate conference is that there is a lot of capital available to pay for infrastructure, to fund infrastructure, but there is a need to address the risk that private sector participants will take in making those investments, and that being one of the market challenges in terms of developing infrastructure in Africa. One note that I had is I did look, we presented the average annual growth rates of population projected in Africa. When I looked at what our exports are, there is certainly exports to Africa, but I actually didn't see it currently in sort of some of the top 10 markets when you look at a global scale. So it's important to know it's fast growing, but it's still, in the grand scheme of Canadian exports, is a relatively smaller base in terms of some of the work, in the terms of the context of the work we did here.
There is 1 billion people living in Africa. And of course, 25 years ago, when we looked at China, we saw a very large population, but they weren't buying much either. And that certainly could change. So maybe we'll come back to that in the future and see. I do have a question for John from the chat. And it's one that I had too, John, which was, you're building an elevator out in the, I don't want to say the middle of nowhere, but you're a long way from urban centers, let's say. How do you marshal enough tractor or trucks with concrete to build that elevator? Is that a challenge ever?
So it can be, and Brian Watson, our project manager, was able to join. So I can speak to it as well. But Brian, if you want to chime in, you've seen that firsthand, certainly.
Are you guys?
Yep.
Oh,
Did we lose him? Well, so Barry, what I would say is there are a number of challenges with building any of those types of facilities, whether it comes down to labor, getting materials transported, but the concrete piece can be challenging as well. I'd say two things. You'd be surprised maybe some of the places that you would find a ready mix or a concrete plant. But the other option that we have is you can create what we call a batch plant. So set up a temporary facility that would be nearby. We're typically needing to bring, 2, 3, 4 concrete trucks per hour to keep things moving in these facilities. And we also typically like to have a backup. So to your point or your question earlier about, do you ever have to stop them? Well, one of the key things that, we can't build higher without concrete. The rest of the things we typically have sitting on site, but so we do try and have a backup as well, some redundancies built into the system.
I noticed also in the picture that I see concrete bins and I see steel bins. Why the use for the two, or why not just all one?
Yeah, absolutely. So what, and different people would have different perspectives on this. So I'll just give you my view, which I think is somewhat moderated, probably in the middle. If you are having a facility that has a lot of throughput, a concrete facility can tend to be, over the long run, more robust. So if you think about a paper clip, and you can bend a paper clip several times and it's fine, but if you bend it enough, eventually it'll break and snap. So I'm not suggesting that steel bins are like a paper clip, not saying that at all, but I think the concept is similar, where if you're loading those bins so these facilities that we design and build, a grain storage facility that you would see, the intent, they make money by loading up as much as grain as they can and sending it out as many times as they can in a year. So their entire point is to get grain, not to store it for a long period of time, but to send it through. And so the more you fill and empty a bin, you're stressing that facility. And so for that type of application, you would typically want to see more concrete, which tends to be more robust with a lot of filling and emptying. That said, there are times where if you're having longer term on-farm storage or longer term storage where you're not filling and emptying, a steel bin can be great. And so you'll see on some of our facilities might be some bigger steel tanks that would tend to sit and hold larger amounts for a longer period of time. And that works just fine. But for that workhouse that's filling and emptying all the time, many people would find that concrete can hold up better over a longer period of time, back to that 1969 facility we built in Colorado.
Well, thank you. That clears up one of the questions I've had for a long time. That's very helpful. Joel, I'd like to turn to you. One of the questions that came through is regarding the government's imposition of a 20% reduction in nitrogen fertilizer use to achieve a 30% emissions reduction target for 2020 or below 2020 levels. Did you factor that into your analysis?
No, we didn't. It would be we'd have to look at that specific item. We didn't. This was primarily based on sort of those historical data points we had.
And I guess another part of that was an irrigation development in Saskatchewan, which is we heard about last year, which is also going to have some expansion. I know you can't include everything in your forecast, but obviously these are some of the, I guess, the wrinkles that can alter your results quite a bit.
Yeah, certainly in terms of individual, especially in terms of individual commodities, it could alter, quite a bit, different concepts such as this to expand irrigation and so forth.
John, I see that you have a drone video or something. I'm a sucker for these things.
Okay, only if you want it, but I'll go ahead and show it. And I got my tech issue resolved here, but are you able to see this, Barry?
Yes, perfectly.
So this is drone footage. This is actually a feed mill, so a little different type of facility, but same exact slip form concrete concept. And this is actually, so we talked about building, in rural locations. This is actually nearer to some sort of urban center. So this is just on the south side of Ames, Iowa. That's where our headquarters is. And we're actually in the process of building an educational feed mill for Iowa State University. So I know there's a number of people, yourself included, on the call, Barry, from University of Manitoba. So there is a academic component here. And you'll see, to your point earlier, there are some slabs over there for some steel bins that will go up as well. So this just shows throughout a little bit the life cycle of a project. You can see as this facility is going up. So you can also see some of the crews on deck, that sort of thing. So don't mean to beat a dead horse. You saw the slip form video earlier, but just give you, I'll say, a bird's eye view of some of what happens. So I can leave this on as there are other questions in case, or I can also turn it off as well. But just wanted people to see a little different vantage point on some of these projects as they get built.
One of the things that occurs to me is when you have a crew like that going out, how do you accommodate people? I mean, it must be quite a task just to deal with, or do you try to hire as many local as possible, or how do you deal with your crews?
We do try and hire locally. In terms of accommodations, I suppose that could mean a number of things, but one thing it means is we have to become very close with the local hotel owners, and because for this slip form process, since it is 24 hours a day, there are two different shifts and a lot of people involved throughout that process. So there's a huge influx of people on that project for about a week, and then many of those people will peel off. A core crew will continue through the duration of the project. But yeah, there are a lot of logistics that go into getting that number of people. We do have a great traveling crew that would move around from job site to job site with us, and we really try and supplement that with local people who can help build that project. So it's sort of anywhere and everywhere that we can find people. That's our goal.
So you don't have a caravan of Winnebagos following?
It has been known that people may bring their trailers or their RVs from site to site, and some would even live in those on site if they're allowed or nearby. So I guess it's sort of planes, trains, and automobiles to get people where they need to be on the site.
All right. Joel, there was a question came in on the base case. What did the range of tons say if less wheat, more pulse, so on? How does that affect your forecast depending on what those mix of crops are?
In terms of whether, do you mind just restating, or do you have any?
Well, I guess in the sense that, you know, we're talking about tons, but we're starting to see acreages maybe shifting from some things like pulses don't have as many tons per, at least I better apologize here. I'm not an agronomist, but I know that the yields are not the same for every crop. So if you start moving to lower yielding crops, how does that affect your forecast too?
Yeah, if there's some substitution, well, each commodity, let me think through this. Each commodity we've forecasted separately. We didn't, and this is one of the reasons why we capped harvested areas. We didn't forecast sort of substitution like interactively, but with each commodity. So if pulses were looking to grow and it was lower yield based on those, that would be factored into the base case based on historic trend projections of historic trends in each commodity, and then summed in terms of the consolidated forecast.
Okay. Riel, I'd like to pose a question to you with regard to your customer base. I mean, who are the kind of people who use your facility? I mean, are you seeing some kind of trend or a profile of people who would be involved in these identity preserved crops?
Yes, at this point, obviously they're smaller producers that are starting to do this. They're using our facility to transload. Some customers in the US are looking at sourcing in Canada. And obviously these are all smaller shippers. They're not looking for the 100-car units. I don't know if you know, Barry, we've got 12 elevators from Winnipeg to the US border that have 100-car loops, 12 of them. So we did not want to compete with that. And so we wanted to be, as you mentioned before, a little more boutique. Identity preserved was the first initial line we were going after. And so it's always been our purpose. Sort of the smaller shipper. We got a lot of specialty crops in southern Manitoba that, you know, they either have to ship it by container, or if they're shipping by bulk, they can use our facility as a transloading facility to go into the US and Mexico. And that's the customers we've been after, and we've had relatively good success with that.
Are you getting more younger farmers? Is this something that is generational in terms of?
That's a good, I don't know. You know, there's the anti-Canadian Wheat Board farmer that's out there. He wants to do his own marketing. And so is that just a trend, or is that where we're going? And these farms are not little farms. They're multi, I mean, you know, 10,000 acre farms. So there's no reason why they can't be marketing their own grain. And some of them are just starting to look at that. They're starting to consider their options. You know, instead of selling it to an elevator who gets their percentage or whatever, some of them are looking at doing their own transloading right from our facility right here. So it's funny. There's a little bit of everything out there. Yeah.
It is interesting. I mean, reading some time ago this year where they were talking about farms becoming more specialized and focusing on smaller acres as opposed to just getting bigger and bigger. And so maybe this kind of thing is a trend where we see the two divisions of the marketplace happening at once.
Right.
10 elevators between Winnipeg and the border seems like a lot. John, is there any chance of overbuilding?
It's not just from the valley. It comes from outside of the Red River Valley for sure. It's coming all the way from Saskatchewan. You know, some of it is coming into the area, into the Red River Valley. So they are drawing from a long ways. But yeah, that's 10 to 12, 100-car loops. But those 100-car loops are meant to go to Vancouver. They're not meant to go to the IP so much. So it's a little bit different market that we're into. We're not competing head to head, no.
Oh, I appreciate that. Well, you know, it's also sometimes nice to allow the panel to ask questions amongst themselves. Do any of the panel members have questions they'd like to pose?
I had one. It was kind of a, first of all, thanks for the presentation, both on the construction of the large scale elevators and smaller scale. I've been to a few elevators, and you miss all that detail that goes into the construction when you just see it. You can't get into the back end. I was just curious with the slip forming. What causes kind of the different striations? Is that in the concrete when it's cured? Is that the just natural variation in the concrete, or some environmental factor, and what are some of the things you have to do to for quality control? Because obviously you don't want to be ripping out part of that if it's ongoing. So yeah, that was just some of my, thanks for the presentation.
For sure, thanks.
Are you guys able to hear me? Hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Give it a go. We'll see how you do.
Well, I'll try to take that one here. So as the slip process goes up, we have guys that are tied off on scaffolding that follow and trails as the concrete comes out of the forms. And the guys use manual labor to brush and rub the walls to fill any impurities in the wall as it comes out of the forms. So you're able to see kind of in 12-foot increments, because it's 12 foot an hour, or 12 foot a shift, I mean, roughly in that range of the different levels of curing and finishing. You can see the guys down there on the scaffold that trails after the slip form gets off the ground.
So sometimes, yeah, if you're seeing the individual kind of lines, that would be from the individual finishing trowel. So over a brief period of time, a handful of months, that would kind of bleach out or phase out. But if you do get very heavy rains or particular weather patterns, you can, if you've got a close enough eye, at least some people would tell you that they can see those throughout. Yeah, so when it comes to quality control, within that 7 to 10 day process, it's kind of all hands on deck to make sure that you're getting all of your rebar reinforcement, steel in place. You're testing the concrete as it's coming out of the trucks. Inspectors on site, making sure that things are going in at the appropriate times and locations. So people refer to it as somewhere between organized chaos and kind of a ballet or an orchestra. It's orchestrated ballet taking place on the slip deck. In reality, it's probably somewhere in between those two.
I understand that the elevator at Dougal is replacing a concrete elevator that was built 1908 or sometime. Any projections on the lifespan of these facilities?
Well, so yeah, and I think that elevator was the Transcona, which was kind of referred to sometimes as the Leaning Tower of Pisa or Leaning Tower of Canada. Had some settlement issues, over a century ago. Typically, if we're talking lifespan, it's hard to say. We refer back to that Colorado facility, which is not out of the norm to be up and running 60 years later. But I'd say typically for concrete, plan on a 50-year lifespan. If you're looking at steel, you might expect something less than that. We don't do a lot of steel, so I probably won't say, because I don't want to. Not intending to get into any arguments, but say 50 years plus. And oftentimes what would happen is, by that point, either demographics have changed or the geography has changed. And, maybe there's a need for a facility somewhere else. A city has grown up around the facility, and so it's not in an ideal location, or you can't get rail in. So sometimes I would say often it's not, that the facility is no longer able to be run, but there are some logistical or geographic changes that have taken place that make it not ideal at that point.
We've certainly seen this boom in elevator construction since 2012. What's happening in the US? Is it just steady growth, stable, plateaued? What's happening there?
Pretty significant changes. Brian, jump in real quick if you like.
There was a big boom before the boom in Canada, and then that has since dwindled off, but it's been more on the processing side. Guys buying grain and processing it into a feed or other products.
Oh,
And Barry, one thing that we've seen, and this is kind of on I'll say a somber note, there have been some significant weather events in the last handful of years. The derecho is I guess what we call it, different than a tornado, but we also just last week had a major tornado that came through many of the Midwestern states and especially Kentucky, and those have torn through many facilities and are creating a ton of rebuilds. Most of those would have been steel bins, so are being often replaced with steel bins, although some owners are choosing to replace with concrete. Not that you always want to have to build for a tornado, but we really didn't see concrete facilities that were taken down by the tornado. So, sometimes there are good reasons in market growth, and sometimes there are some, I'll say, kind of sadder reasons why there would be some building booms, but yeah, there's a lot of number of, I'll say, waves over the years that we've experienced. It does seem like they go in waves.
certainly the comment, about the tornadoes, and we have the storms in Vancouver and the drought here in the prairies. It seems like weather-related disturbances are becoming a factor. Now, maybe it's just 1 year. Let's hope it isn't the long term, but climate change predictions are basically suggesting stronger weather is coming, and also more temperatures, higher temperatures, and crops that may not deal quite so well. Joel, did you get that factored into your? I know you said at the end about the climate change. I guess you have to be kind of neutral on this, but is there any sort of sense within the people that you presented this to as to what they see in terms of climate change?
Yeah, it's a good question. In looking back at the report, it was probably an area we could have expanded a little bit on. So I don't have a sense. I'd be curious if anybody on the panel has a sense. We've capped our harvested area to I don't know, be conservative, but to factor in that harvested area can't continue growing. But there's a lot of discussion about how crops might substitute and how area might expand, contract. We haven't been able to find any. When I looked at some recent literature, kind of in preparing, it didn't have necessarily a definitive conclusion on one way or the other in terms of how that will impact at a macro level volumes going forward at this point. But certainly curious anybody else on the panel or in the audience has any thoughts on it.
One of the things that we've been reading about is the Great Clay Belt of Northern Ontario. Most people don't realize that there was a lake as big as Lake Agassiz. Well, I don't know Agassiz, but at least it's an area that's equal to 1.5 times Manitoba's agricultural land in Northern Ontario in this clay belt. It's always been too cold, and drainage is a problem to be developed. But as climate change is moving north, this area is being looked at, and there's suggestions that it could come into production as early as 2035 or maybe earlier than that with a much larger. So John, keep your eyes open for Northern Ontario. Maybe this is where maybe that extra canola will come from as well to serve the market. It is a changing situation. Again, any forecasts now have to be looked at in terms of the light of will the weather actually go back to something more normal and predictable, or are we going to see greater variations over time? Maybe a theme for another conference. On that note, if there are any last questions from the audience, we should take them. We've got only about a few minutes left, and I don't want to keep anybody over time. With that, let me take the opportunity then to thank the panel. It was extremely interesting. I felt like I learned a lot more about elevators and how they're built and some of the issues, and certainly makes my job look pretty simple compared to trying to organize the build of a continuous flow concrete structure. And Joel, congratulations to you on bravery for putting out a forecast, and Riel, to you for striking into a new market area. It'll be really interesting to see whether that is something that will grow and continue growing. And I see from the audience, people really appreciate your presentation. So thank you for that. Before I do close the meetings, though, I do have some thank yous of my own that I need to give to the broader group and certainly to all the presenters who presented earlier today. We really appreciate the time you've taken to prepare your presentations and also to be with us today and give your presentations and answer the questions. I know that it comes out of your time and you have to fit the rest of your work in around it. Also, of course, our sponsors, again, we couldn't do this without you. We really appreciate the help of our sponsors. They've been rolling by. I hope you appreciate them as well, and thank them if you see them, representatives that they supported the Fields on Wheels. It certainly is important to us. Also, of course, I have to thank my team. There's a lot of people working in the background, and I'm going to just read their names because they deserve to be given credit in public. And that's Siobhan Van de Keer, Renata Castro, Crystal Jorgensen, and Rihanna Lair Bacher, who did all the background to get the publicity out and the information. And so we have our crowd here today where we did get over 300 delegates in total. And we really appreciate everybody who came. And finally, I would also like to make sure we do thank Chris Rogalski and Trevor Tomlinson, who made all the magic happen with the Zoom. Again, without you guys, none of this would be possible. And finally, to the session chairs who also had a role in the background in developing the agenda. And thank you, gentlemen, for your assistance again. I really appreciate it. With that, I would like to draw to a close the 26th annual Fields on Wheels. And I'm hopeful that there will be a 27th, and we'll keep you informed. Again, folks, thanks very much for your attendance, and bye for now.